My name's Paul Newton. I've been painting for quite a few years. Probably mostly what I do these days are portraits, and I've been doing those for probably 25 years now. It's scary when I think how long it's been going for. And prior to that, I worked as an illustrator in the advertising industry for a bit. For a bit meaning like 7 years, approximately. Which I enjoyed, but the deadlines were terrible. You were given a job and you'd say, when is it due? And they'd say, yesterday. So there's always a lot of pressure. But I studied at an art school in Sydney called Julian Ashton's, which is a very kind of classical, traditional, European style art atelier, art school. I'm reminded of that kind of, the way Aquinas spoke of the transcendentals, that the people before him kind of derived that notion of the truth, beauty, and goodness as being those three transcendental qualities that go beyond the material world. And so in the case of beauty, even though beauty for the most part relates as we experience it to the physical world, it transcends that, it goes beyond that. And it's something that resonates. Beauty is very hard to define. I was actually looking up like a dictionary definition of beauty, and it didn't really provide much insight. It was, to me, it felt like it was struggling to nail a definition, but it spoke about attractiveness, pleasing shapes, pleasing design. I think it comes down to something that resonates deep with the human heart, soul, something that feels balanced, that feels there's a sense of radiance, something that might kind of metaphorically glow with beauty. Again, I'm using the word to try and describe what it is, which is a bit going around in circles. But it's something that you innately recognises when you encounter it. And it's hard to put your finger on exactly what it is that you've seen, but you know when you've seen it. Like if you see a beautiful girl, it's hard to know what that actually means. Maybe it's just the proportions of the different parts of her figure or face, but nonetheless it's something that seems to be ingrained in us that we recognise in certain situations. And I think it also ties in with truth and goodness. Like if you look at some of the great religious art by people like Michelangelo, the Pietà, for instance, there's something beautiful. It's beautifully executed, particularly from a very young, at that stage, sculptor. I think he was only in his early 20s when he created that. But it's also reflecting the goodness of Mary's embrace of her dead son. And I think pity, the Pietà means the pity and piety, is my understanding at least. In other words, there's more than just the beauty that you see, but the rest of the story helps to enhance that with those other attributes of goodness and truth. I think because of the nature of beauty as a transcendental, meaning that it transcends the world, the physical world that we live in day to day, that speaks of something which is beyond the world we see with our five senses. Even though beauty is something that we experience with those senses, it speaks to us as something that goes beyond just the physical parameters that we encounter. When you start to think of the things that are beyond this physical world, the eternal verities, it's pointing you in the direction of the Creator. So I think probably that to me is, when you're struck by something beautiful, you think, why am I moved by this? What is it that's infused something into this physical object that moves me maybe to tears, a beautiful piece of music or a beautiful piece of art or anything beautiful. And it stops you in your tracks, and you're forced to consider the world of the spirit, the things that are beyond this physical world. And I think that points us pretty readily to God, the source of all this beauty. I think sometimes art speaks, you could, for example, have someone tell you about the story of Jesus, the Gospels, the Christian message in words, and that gets to the intellect. But art is another alternative approach where you're speaking to the heart, the soul of the person. And in many ways, it really bypasses the intellect. Good art, great art, just really speaks to the soul. It forces you to encounter, or at least to be open. If you are open to it, it allows you to encounter the source of that beauty. There's other elements of beauty, things like balance and composition and harmony within the range of colours that might be in a painting. For example, the continuity of texture in a sculpture, the way it relates, and it's not just this part is at odds with this other part. There's a homogeneous reality that you experience. So I think it's just a vehicle by which we can experience. I suppose I'm repeating myself somewhat, but it's a vehicle by which we can experience God, the transcendental realities of God. In my portrait work, which is what I mostly do, I'm always keen to try and capture authentically the person I'm portraying in the painting, so that there's something that will, again, resonate with the viewer, in particular, close friends or family of that person if they see the painting. Yeah, so there'll be something, ideally, that, again, is not just a technical element in a painting. For example, when I'm working on a portrait, I'm looking at the canvas, I'm adding paint, and I'm trying to get a likeness to the subject that I'm painting. But at the end of the day, what I'm really wanting to see in the painting is a reflection of the presence of the person, not just a physical, superficial likeness, although that's important, you need to have that, but it needs to be more than that. It needs to be something that allows you to get a sense of the presence of the person, so you feel like you're actually present there in some fashion. And if you feel that that's the case, then I think I've been successful. Oftentimes I'll not feel that, and if I've been working on a portrait, I usually start with the head, and I might spend 10 hours working on that through the day and half the night. And if I get to the end of that period of time and it's kind of 1 o'clock in the morning and I just can't work any longer because I'm dead on my feet, because I stand when I'm painting. When I get to that stage, if I haven't got a sense of their presence looking back at me from the canvas, then I know it's failed, and I'll just scrape it off and start again the next day. There's a thing called the golden ratio that the Greeks described as the divine proportion, because they saw that God, or gods in their worldview, had infused nature with this proportion. And if you look at the human body or animals or plants, that proportion, which is there's a mathematical derivation to describe it mathematically, is something that is ubiquitous through nature. And when you incorporate that into your artwork, our creation as opposed to that which God has created, similarly, it reflects something which is very it produces a very comfortable proportion within which, so if you've got a picture, say you've got a landscape, Turner used to do this, the British artist. You've got a landscape painting, say these are the proportions of the canvas, and if you measure the golden ratio across the horizontal dimension of the canvas and place some important element, say in Turner's case it might have been a train on a viaduct or a boat on the horizon of the water, or even the horizon of the water itself. If you use the golden ratio as a way of positioning that element that you want to be a focal point in your picture, it will look comfortable. It'll look, all other things being equal, if you do a decent job of the painting, it's a reflection of reality. And I guess for that reason, when you infuse your work with it, it has something of the design element that God has infused nature with, such that things look pleasing and natural and comfortable. And so when I was doing the First Catholics, when I was doing all of the larger paintings for Domus Australia, there were 32 in total, but the larger ones, as I was working on them, I wanted to put a cross, a crucifix, in some way in each of them. It's just something I kind of felt like doing. Maybe I was guided to do that, I don't know. And in the case of the First Catholics, there was a crucifix on the little table where the pyx containing the consecrated communion host, that was the focal point for the prayer gatherings, was positioned. And where the two cross beams of the cross are is exactly where the golden ratio, like within a centimetre on a 1.8 metre high canvas. So it was very precisely positioned, and I didn't plan it. There are a few other things like that have happened to me, and I remember thinking, okay, so God was involved with this in a way that I wasn't consciously aware of at all. And yet he was still aware, yet he was still present, he was still working. Because I invited him, I was pleading for his help, because I just, I struggle. As I say, painting's really hard, so if I can get a bit of assistance from God, then that's obviously critically important. I mean, there's countless examples of great art. I mean, I'm a big fan of so many artists. I could give you a big long list of them, but all the usual big names that you can well imagine. Velázquez being probably the top of the list, the Spanish master. What strikes me about works by people like him is that, again, it's the beauty, the compositions that he uses, the way he places elements within a picture plane that the viewer looks at, the sense of realism that he evokes in paint in a somewhat impressionistic manner. And yet you stand back from the canvas and the thing just coalesces and looks real. And I think when you look at that, whether you have faith or no faith at all, it takes you beyond the material world, beyond the physical presence of a piece of art, and you're looking at what is it that created. We know who created it, the artist created it, but what is it that allows me to look at this painting that was done 500 years ago and be moved by it today in a way that a photograph that you see on a billboard doesn't. There's some integrity there. There's the other thing is great art that opens the spirit to God. Is another attribute of that type of art is that you can look at it over and over and over, and each time you do, you see something more in it. It's like reading the scriptures. Each time you read them, you think, oh, I didn't see that last time. It reveals gradually more and more of its essence, when you allow yourself the time to do that, when you contemplate great art, which is why you can keep going back to, you know, these great art galleries. If you're going to the Louvre in Paris or the Met in New York or any great art gallery in the world, and you've been there before, it's not like once done. You know, you'd almost, if you have a love of art, you'll almost, and particularly if you're an artist, the thought of going back again to see the very same works that you've seen before, in no way is the joy diminished because you've seen them before, because you know that you'll see something new with this new viewing of the work. So in this painting, The First Catholics of Sydney, circa 1818, when I was asked originally by Cardinal Pell, who commissioned the works for Domus Australia, to do this, he pointed me to a stained glass window in St Mary's Cathedral that also depicts the same event, but in a very different way. It shows it's a clandestine meeting of the early Catholic community, predominantly Irish convicts and settlers and people who, there was a priest in the colony, Jeremiah O'Flynn, and he was kicked out because he wasn't meant to be there officially. So he left a consecrated communion host, and that then was the focal point for their prayer meetings. So they would gather in either the Dempsey or Davis home in the Rocks in Sydney to have these prayer gatherings, and that's what I was depicting. The stained glass window in St Mary's Cathedral shows the same event, but from the street, and all you really see of the group, you don't actually see the group inside from memory. I think you see the kind of golden, warm light from the interior of the room, and a couple of redcoat guards out on the street, and someone, you know, chatting them up, trying to get them off the scent, I suppose. So therefore I came up with this concept that was different to what had been done before, to try and produce a fresh perspective on that theme. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the focal point for me in all of these paintings, or at least a major inclusion, was going to be the cross. And I did a lot of research before beginning this painting, and there was an exhibition of some of the elements, the crucifix and other things that they actually had at the home where this took place, in the downstairs in the St Mary's Cathedral, in the crypt. So I went and borrowed those elements and photographed them, and placed this whole thing together. Got a group of people, friends and family, and dressed them in period costumes. And my daughter Jessica, who's the one wearing the white bonnet with her kind of big white eyes, who I also used as the model for a few years earlier as baby Jesus in Our Lady of the Southern Cross. I dressed my kids and other family friends up, and some teachers at the local school also dressed up for me. And then I put the composition together the way you see it. And I suppose what I was wanting to do in this case was to show the humanity of the people. You know, this was a group of people who were obviously, you know, struggling with life somewhat. They weren't allowed to meet. There were no masses or sacraments. There was no priest in the colony. This is the best they could do, and they were trying to live out their Christian Catholic faith in this way by meeting together. And I wanted to show that it was every level of the socio-economic range of the population, from a broad-arrowed insignia convict through to someone who's, you know, a bit more well-dressed and maybe a bit more well-to-do. And I also wanted to kind of just show the way people in a situation like that might naturally relate. So you've got, you know, here's a woman here with a young baby, and then there's a young girl here who's looking up this way, and she might be looking at this young man. He's almost certainly looking at her, but she also might be looking at the baby. There's a little bit of ambiguity. So I wanted to create little subplots in order just to create a sense that these people weren't, you know, posing in a photographic sense for a painting, but rather they were depicting an event that albeit somewhat theatrically, may be represented by this kind of a composition. And the other thing I wanted to do was to provide, I was very strongly influenced by Caravaggio and the work of Caravaggio. In fact, I remember Cardinal Pell, when I was in Rome one time before I started the project, he was showing me one of the cathedrals in Rome that had 3 paintings, major canvases by Caravaggio, the life of St. Matthew, calling, the inspiration of, and then the martyrdom of St. Matthew, the 3 works. And what I love, one of the things I love about his work is that strong chiaroscuro, the light and shadow effect that creates such drama. So in a kind of a lighter version, I've tried to capture something of that light and shadow in this painting, but the light source, the light illuminating the figures, is the candle light, so it's by definition going to be very soft light. And if you look at any of these figures, you can kind of see the backlight, which is a bluish light, which might be from the window at the back, unseen, that would provide that that backlight. So again, I was thinking of the aesthetics. How do I make this? How do I try and create a sense of beauty where you've got the mixture of colours that help to tell the story, but in a way which is aesthetically pleasing. In addition to this use of the golden ratio, which we spoke of before. It was amazing how many serendipitous things took place during the Domus project, things that I had no control over, but they worked out for the best, even with Our Lady of the Southern Cross. So when I painted this, one of the things that was important for me to get right, and again the authenticity issue, is the Southern Cross, the title of Mary in this particular composition. So, and I'd studied astronomy as part of my science degree when I was at university, so I was really keen to get the celestial bodies of the southern sky, including the Southern Cross, but everything else in the southern sky, in its right place, so that someone looking at this would see that it was correct. And so I put the Southern Cross over here, and then the pointers are over this side, and other stars are in their right position. But what hadn't occurred to me at the time, but it did later when I was doing a talk on this painting, is that if you were to take a time-lapse photograph of the southern sky from that position, where the whole thing would be revolving around Mary. She's positioned at the south celestial pole of the southern night sky. Again, I didn't plan that, but it was kind of interesting for me to think that really this whole southern sky, the Southern Cross, Mary, Our Lady of the Southern Cross, was going to be revolving around the figure of Mary in this painting.